Eina rangatira, tena koto, tena tato katoa, ko nu te awa, ko grandfather te monga, ko Boo, North Carolina te wahi, ko Tamaki Makaru aho, ko J. Marlowe toku ingoa. Kia ora, my name is Jay Marlowe. I am a professor of social work and co-director for the Center for Asia-Pacific Refugee Studies at the University of Auckland. It's an absolute pleasure to be hosting this webinar, and thank you for your forbearance whilst we try and sort out the technical issues that we're currently experiencing. Before we get underway, I would just like to start with a karakia, and then I'll just talk you through the plan for this afternoon's webinar. Whakataka te ho ki te uru, whakataka te ho ki te tonga, kia mā kina ki uta, kia mā tarakara ki tai, e ki aka ana te atakura, he tia, he huka, he hohu, ti he mori ora. So welcome to the Safe Start Fair Future community webinar. The Safe Start Fair Future report represents a collaborative work between the Center for Asia-Pacific Refugee Studies and the Asylum Seeker Support Trust, in which we launched a report at Parliament just about maybe 5-6 weeks ago, which was hosted by Ibrahim, and to talk about the ideas around a safe start for asylum seekers and a fair future for convention refugees. And that's really what brings us here to talk today. And so what I would like to do is I'd like to introduce our hopefully 4 esteemed panelists. We have 2 of them at the moment. So what I might do is I might introduce them, and if we can get May and Solomon online, then I will introduce them in due course. So just to start off with Ibrahim, he became an MP to represent communities who often struggle to have their voices heard. His experience spans fleeing his home country in Eritrea, being in a refugee camp, working as a minimum wage cleaner, to graduating from university and representing low-paid workers as a union organizer. Since becoming involved in politics at university, Ibrahim has taken every opportunity to work for a better tomorrow. He has chaired the board of Changemakers Resettlement Forum, been involved in governance for the living wage movement, and knocked on hundreds of doors and made thousands of calls as a labor volunteer. During his time in Parliament, Ibrahim has advocated for migrant communities, refugees, and low-paid workers across Aotearoa. He is also the co-chair of the New Zealand Parliamentary Friendship Group to facilitate closer ties between New Zealand, Africa, and the Middle East. Kia ora, Ibrahim, and welcome.
Kia ora, Jay. Namihi nui kia koutou katoa. Assalamu alaikum. I think you've said it in you said it all in your introduction, and I'm the Labour List MP. At the moment, I'm actually based in Auckland. When I got elected, I was Wellingtonian, and in the last few months, I've made progressive transition to Auckland, and the reason is because Auckland is big, and that's where the communities are. Basically, I've been working on making some connections and putting some foundations with our communities. So obviously, my the asylum seekers issue is something that I take a huge interest on. Since when I was in community, member of the community, but also leader in the community, especially as a chair of Changemakers board. I've done a lot of events. I've attended a lot of talks. I was in a lot of panels, simply because this is it's a human rights issue, and it's something that we need to we need to sort. I hope that's enough, and we can do the rest.
That's great, Ibrahim, and look forward to discussing through these considerations further. I'd also like to introduce Golriz Ghahraman, who's an Iranian Kiwi and made history as the first ever person from a refugee background to be sworn in as an MP, having arrived in Aotearoa as a child asylum seeker with her family from Iran. Her studies at Oxford and a career as a lawyer in New Zealand and overseas have focused on enforcing human rights and holding governments to account. Before entering Parliament as a list MP for the Green Party, Golriz was active in the NGO community, volunteering her skills to advance justice reform, refugee and migrant rights, and for family carers of disabled persons. Kia ora, Golriz, and welcome.
Kia ora. You do want us to do intros now, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so when I first stood for Parliament, it's not the case that I ever wanted to be a politician, but I did want to be a Green. But when I first stood, I thought I was standing as a human rights lawyer. That's what I'd been doing. I'd been working for the United Nations, and I'd come back to New Zealand. But someone figured out very quickly that if elected, I would be the first so-called refugee MP. And I actually say refugee, by the way, rather than a person from a refugee background. Because whilst I understand that we all do want to have that choice and that agency and move on from our displacement, that there are people that are currently in the process and they are currently refugees or asylum seekers seeking that status. So I want to kind of work on having that shame and anxiety and prejudice dissipate. But someone figured out I'd be the first refugee MP, so I always have that in my intros now. But it's a huge thing, as Ibrahim knows now as well, to have to represent a vast and diverse community globally and here in Aotearoa. But my fear of tokenism itself also dissipated very quickly when I started to hear from the communities, again, around our little island nation, but also globally. Under Trump's America at the time, and people going through Brexit, and realized that there had been this real void in representation. So I take it very seriously. We get a lot of hate and we get a lot of love, and both are heartbreaking, because these are communities that are the most marginalized, having lived through a war or persecution as a member of an already marginalized community in your country of origin, and then having fled that and survived, to be then marked with the prejudice of either racism or that fear of the mass arrivals that we all as a community face is absolutely not right. So the kind of things that we're going to talk about today, I think, are the closest to my heart, because our job as MPs are to be representatives as much as we are lawmakers. So, you know, and I arrived here as a child asylum seeker, so it's very close to my heart, in particular, remembering my little scared Iranian political refugee parents, little hipsters, arriving here and turning into this part of this mass of faceless people that we call refugees. So thank you for holding the forum.
Yes. Well, so thanks, Golriz. And really, I mean, I think as you can see from the background behind me, that we're here to talk about this idea of a safe start and a fair future in Aotearoa. And really, one of the things that the report signals is that there are these differences in the ways in which New Zealand treats people, depending on the ways in which they arrive to New Zealand. Mm-hmm. And so I guess really it would be, I would actually like to open up the first question, which is really, if you could just sort of talk us through maybe some of those differences. People talk about asylum seeker, convention refugees, quota refugees. Could you just brief us, maybe tell us some of the main differences between these groups and how they might be treated differently?
Yeah, so I don't think anyone knows what a refugee is to begin with. Oh, there's my cat. So I always kind of start by saying a refugee is a person who didn't want to leave. So when you think about the people that have to leave, there has been a war or there's been persecution, so serious harm. You're facing torture or death, disappearance in some political prison as a result of your race, ethnicity, nationality, political, the refugee. So first of all, we hold that. And if we say that everyone has the right to escape war or harm serious enough to be akin to torture, for example, as a result of persecution, they can leave. They can cross over the border in the country where they were facing that danger, and they can claim asylum. Now, the way that they leave and where they arrive shouldn't be determinative of whether or not they're granted safety or support. Quota refugees happen to be people who have crossed the border and gone to a UN refugee camp and been processed there, as is their right, and been found to be refugees. They have that status, and then they're resettled in a third country like New Zealand. Convention refugees are those who've crossed this border and asked to be processed here in New Zealand. And again, as is their right to do. So we to say that you should come from a UN camp, when you look at it that way, depends, it's absolutely dependent on where you are, what resource you have, how you're escaping, what your source of fear and persecution is. And to say that that will be determinative of your resettlement support is bizarre, but it is absolutely the case here. So when my family and I arrived here, we came through Malaysia. It's a country that doesn't have the Refugee Convention, so a lot of people can enter, but you become stateless, vulnerable, and can't stay. So a lot of people come through, for example, a second state where they cross the border into a third state that doesn't even have refugee rights. So in our case, that's where we had to escape from. Arrived in New Zealand, came down that wee escalator at Auckland Airport so that we were on New Zealand soil, and found the first official person and said, we're refugees, what do we do? And they told us the process, which is as it should be. But then we were released into the wild. So we got no resettlement support. If you arrive on the quota, you go to Mangere Refugee Centre, where there's a medical team, there's some mental health support, and there's 6 weeks of this resettlement support and I've visited, and anyone who's visited, it's quite heartwarming. There's classrooms for kids, there's some English language support for everybody. It's not by any means necessarily enough for the quota refugees, but once they are helped to join the community, they've had that support. Asylum seekers don't. Asylum seekers get none of that support. So while they're waiting for their case to be heard, they're just in New Zealand, having come from a place of trauma without any way of knowing how to resettle. And what I also always like to talk about, and I think Ibrahim will agree, is that actually this isn't great for New Zealand. The more we can help people to resettle properly into the community quickly, when they've escaped a trauma, as we have agreed is their fundamental human right to do, the better it is for the whole community. So the less they become isolated, the more they know how to access services that are available, the better the whole community will be that they're joining. Often they'll have kids, sometimes they're on their own, a lot of times they're on their own. They need to know that once they get their refugee status, they can access different supports, and that might look like family reunification. None of that is afforded to asylum seekers, who are convention refugees, as we call them. I think I'll leave it there because I am a little bit.
That's great, Golriz, and I'd like to come back to this idea of even kind of going out into the wild. But Ibrahim
I should say the people who helped us, as is the case now, is so it's like my parents and a 9-year-old child, me, were the Salvation Army. So it's NGOs. It's people stepping in, but of course the Salvation Army are a Christian organization. We didn't have an issue with that, but you can imagine that there might be instances where a queer asylum seeker coming from a place where there was a religious persecution aspect, that might not fit. But because there isn't a systemic way of supporting people resettle, that we take what we can get, and it's not always safe and it's not always appropriate. But shout out to the Sallies because they did help.
Yes, great. So I'd like to shift to you, Ibrahim, because I mean you've actually been a support of us for us even throughout even writing this report, and we've had a number of conversations with you. So is there anything you'd like to elaborate, or even to maybe talk about the ways in which there might be some differences around how support is provided to these different groups of people? You're on mute there, Ibrahim.
Thanks, Jay. Thanks again for organizing this forum today. It's a very important discussion that we need to have. Look, I think Golriz perfectly has explained it, all the distinction between the quota refugees, asylum seekers, and convention refugees. And to me, as a matter of principle, we shouldn't have all these names because no one wants to leave his warm home where he grew up with his family, friends, and where he has everything, and go into an uncertain future. The day that I have decided to leave, I was quite young, and I've never left the country, and I didn't know what the future would look like. I didn't know whether I was gonna make it or not. And you don't leave your parents, your family, your loved ones, and go down this kind of roads. So nonetheless, I had to, because the alternative for me was basically it could be either slow days or disappearance, and who knows, it could have been anything really. And then some of us, like you leave your country, because to be called a refugee, you have to leave your country of origin where you're feeling fear, and go into the next country where you can seek refugee status if you're, lucky enough to come through the UNHCR refugee camps. And then once you are accepted there, and then you do accept it there, so not to be resettled to a third country, just for you to enjoy refugee status, to be safe from persecution, from any sort of deportation back to your own country, where you could seek or you can face a danger. So, and then after that, if you're lucky enough, then you get a resettlement to a third country. And globally, it's really, we need to remember that only less than 1% of refugees in refugee camps get opportunity to be resettled to a third country. This is a very tiny number of the actual number of refugee camps. If we're talking about 25 million, and you can imagine 1% of that. So, and then, so in New Zealand, we have what we call the quota refugee. You turn up to, you go through all the process. New Zealand sent its immigration officers. They interview all the background checks, and then you come to New Zealand. I've actually got my PR at the airport. And then you go to Mangere, where you go through 6 weeks of intense orientations. And that's, you go through the mental health support if you need it, and there is a language, you name it. And then you go to a home that's prepared for you, and everything is ready for you, really. And the support organizations, you've got your volunteer supporters that are gonna take you to shopping, and but others are not lucky enough to have this. Why this this distinction? I don't quite understand why and who put this in place. If you ask me, I think there is a question about the convention refugees exclusion from the NZRRS. Until now, we're gonna touch on that later on, but to me it doesn't seem right.
So look, we'll come back to that distinction of why these differences, because I think that this in some ways really kind of hinges on some of the most critical issues that we're wanting to discuss. But we've now got another face on the screen, and I'd like to welcome Solomon Samson to the conversation. So kia ora, Solomon. If I can just introduce you just quickly, and thanks for sticking with trying to get through the technical issues. But Solomon is a former refugee who arrived in New Zealand as an asylum seeker. He first settled in Wellington, is now based in Christchurch. He has a master's in environmental engineering and is specialized in waste engineering specifically. He has experiences in environmental management, wastewater treatment, hazardous waste management, and doing this with implementation with various UN organizations. Kia ora, Solomon. Welcome to the webinar.
Kia ora, good afternoon.
And Solomon, so good to have you on here. We've just been discussing some of the different pathways that quota convention refugees might take in terms of support, the experiences of asylum seekers. But you've also had that experience. I mean, could you tell us just a little bit about what that was like for you when you actually claimed asylum and when you were accepted, and did you feel safe?
Thank you for the opportunity. Yes, when I first come to before 5 years, maybe I will give some background information before I start.
Sure.
So I will summarize what I, in three keywords, the journey. It was stressful. Sometimes also you feel loneliness. And the time was very long, so you feel like you are in limbo for a long time. So before I go to detail, maybe I can give you some background information about the situation I got. So one of the main problems I faced was, when I see it now back, is housing. So we all know that, especially in Wellington, to find housing which is affordable, it's not easy for, especially for an asylum seeker. So that was one of the main problem. Yeah, so there was only one organization which was really helping the asylum seekers. They were change makers, refugee form. So they were helping us from everything from starting bank account to work permit or something, but it takes a time to get a bit settled and to start work. It takes few weeks, even months. So it's not easy to find housing in the first when you first arrive. So I can tell from my experience or what I have seen in Wellington. So the change makers, they were trying to help. For example, they call to community members who are active and who are willing to help. So they call them. So they tell them, are you keen to, or are you kind enough to provide them for 1 week to stay with you? So you have to stay 1 week with one person, then another week with another. So we can imagine how difficult it could be. I was lucky enough, I got a house with community. They are called social community, Catholic social workers. So through the change makers, they told them if I can live with them for 2 weeks. So I was lucky enough, I ended up staying there 2 years and six months until I find my social housing, like from city council. So the housing was the most problem for the people who are coming as asylum, because of we all know you cannot find in TradeMe housing which is affordable, and being you are an asylum seeker, you have no referee or something. So the main issue for me is housing. So the solution that I think which helps is maybe we can take some experience from other countries, especially from Europe. I can take an example from Germany. So the first thing they will do is, once an asylum seeker comes, they will give him emergency housing, or let's say it's called asylum seeker accommodation or whatever. So that gives them a good space to sleep at least, or even if they want to cry, whatever they want to do. Then they are also not only giving them a house, they are also giving them a community, because what I have observed is they have living together in a group. So I have seen some people, they live in one room, one person, in one room, 2 person, even 4, it doesn't matter. As far as they are all asylum seekers, and they know they will stay there until their case is verified, until their case is processed. So that is something we can learn, or we can take from experience of other Europes, like Germany, or even in London or something. The third problem was for me was it's long. The process is very, very long. To give you some perspective, it took me just to get interviewed 5 months. So I think the officer has to come from Auckland to give me interviews. And the second thing is, for the process to get a yes or no, it took me like 1 year and few days. So you have to be in limbo for, we are talking about 17 months or 18 months just to wait for, you know. So there is a lot of uncertainty. There is a lot of, you know, because you are always in limbo, because waiting for long is, it makes you tired, you know, it weakens your heart or your spirit. So the first 6 months, 12 months, or even the first 2 years are very important for the asylum seekers. So if you can provide them housing, some sense of community, and if we can do also the time, like a fixed time, let's say the process has to finish in 6 months, or from 6 months to 12 months, then it's cool. Because it seems it's like open. We don't know when it's going to come. So there is always uncertainty. There is also fear. Yeah. So these are the 3 points, the key points I said.
That's really useful, Solomon. And even before you were able to join the call, I mean, Golriz also sort of uses this idea of almost kind of being out in the wild, and you spoke about limbo. And how that this lack of housing support, and Golriz also spoke about sort of lack of mental health support that can be afforded to other groups, and you know, actually creates a very different experience for people. And then you've also just highlighted a critical point, which is the uncertainty of the refugee status determination process when you apply to be recognized as a refugee, that this can take a very long time. There's lots of uncertainty, but there's a very little, if any, safety net to sort of catch people throughout that process. So I'm just wondering, just before, I mean, so we do want to shift to this idea of a fair future for convention refugees, but if we just stay just one more, just maybe for a minute or two on a safe start. I mean, Solomon, you suggested a few things out of Europe that could possibly be done. I'd like to hear, I don't know, Golriz or Ibrahim, are there any additional things that you'd like to see happen, or you think that would be worth exploring to ensure a safe start for asylum seekers as they pursue their legal right to be recognized as a refugee in New Zealand?
Well, there's nothing. So it's really easy to list what there should be. So yes, asylum seekers, if they make it to New Zealand, have a right to claim asylum and access the legal process. They also have some other rights in terms of the visa system and what they can access, but they get no practical support that's systemic and government provided. So it depends where you are. It depends what community you are. Sometimes you have come in and found that there is actually a bit of a community from your ethnic background here. Sometimes there's barely anyone. So, you know, finding that kind of support and what Solomon's talking about in terms of someone telling you what you can access is itself a huge problem. So having a service that's dedicated to asylum seeker support that's actually funded would take almost, I was going to say almost nothing, but it would take a very little. So just that idea that we do provide some rights in terms of like, yes, your kids can go to school, or yes, you can work, but like, do people know that? How do they access that? That's not even there. But beyond that, there's this issue of mental health care. There's the issue of like language programs and all of the types of supports that the Resettlement Centre provides for quota refugees that asylum seekers don't get at all. So it's not a matter of information, it's a matter of services actually missing. I also get a little bit worried that people, when we talk about these resources and these services, that they're going to, you know, there's this very valid, I think, fear, especially among marginalized communities who are already here, that there's this resource that's going off to these new arrivals that we don't have. So housing or mental health care, these are things that are scarce for New Zealanders, and in particular for Māori, for the disabilities community, for, you know, we have marginalized communities here already, but just to highlight that the resource it would take to support the tiny number of asylum seekers that we do get to overcome the trauma that they've already experienced and to make the process here less harmful, if not harmful at all, is tiny. We're not talking about a huge resource. We're talking about supporting people who we've already acknowledged have a fundamental right to be free from torture, to join our communities in a way where they can meaningfully join society here in New Zealand. We're talking about children being able to sort of go to school and mothers and fathers finding work, or sort of solo asylum seekers who have arrived here being able to join society, and then in a very short amount of time, we know, with the right support, refugee communities do then engage really meaningfully with their communities here. And I don't ever want to talk about any community having to contribute, but it is the case that they then do go on to contribute. And I think one thing that we haven't talked about that we do need to touch on is that asylum seekers are also a group of people who, although they have access to fundamental right that exists in New Zealand law here, get detained on a regular basis in criminal prisons when they access that right. And we did just get an independent commissioned report come out that outlined the level of trauma and harm that detention system imposes on those who go into there. So there is still an idea that asylum seekers may be unsafe, and the level of prejudice that goes into allowing a community to be detained in a maximum security criminal prison without charge or trial, or any accusation of a specific offence at all, just the idea that they could be a security risk. I think it's really important to hold that prejudice exists in our system, and that's what underpins the lack of resource that we see for resettlement for asylum seekers as well. There's an idea that we have something to fear from this group, even though they're just refugees who've crossed the border and need to be processed just as quota refugees have in another place at another time.
So many thanks, Golriz. And I mean, you've touched on quite a few important points there. And maybe if I can just sort of just summarize those just quickly, and then I think if we can transition to this fair future around some of the convention refugees, and I'd like to move to you, Ibrahim, for that. But just that, Golriz, you did note that we are talking about very small numbers of people, and that you had mentioned dedicated funding through services, and also mental health support through that uncertainty that Solomon had spoken about. And the issues around detention, just that Golriz mentioned, for those of you interested, it relates to Victoria Casey, QC, wrote a report around the issues around detention, and part of that was stimulated by an Amnesty International report, which I would encourage you to have a look at. But Ibrahim, and look, I think we could have spent easily the entire time on just a safe future for asylum seekers, or sorry, safe start for asylum seekers. But the report also talks about this idea of a fair future for people who are recognized as refugees in New Zealand. Once they become asylum seekers to convention, they become convention refugees. They are also treated differently from quota refugees. And Ibrahim, you actually mentioned just briefly earlier something around what you called the NZRRS, which is the New Zealand Refugee Resettlement Strategy. And that's currently under a refresh at the moment. And the strategy, when it was first envisaged, cabinet papers actually show that the intent was for it to eventually be open to all groups of people from refugee backgrounds. And yet 10 years on, it still remains only open to quota refugees. And so I'm just wondering from you, Ibrahim, why do you think convention refugees have been excluded from the New Zealand Refugee Resettlement Strategy until now? You're on mute there, Ibrahim.
Always keep forgetting. Thanks, Jay. If I may just go back to a couple of points Solomon and the Golriz made. I was actually in Changemakers when Solomon and other quite a few people turned up to Wellington, and for many people, I think it's if you're lucky enough, you might have part of your community, from your country. Might be around, and they might show you ways, and they might guide you through the, whatever options are available for you or to you. But many people are not lucky enough. When I first came, I was in Mangere. We actually did have, I don't know how they ended up in Mangere, but we did have quite a few asylum seekers, and then some of those people now have been deported back, and some were actually detained prior to them coming to Mangere. So it really is even not having any sort of resources available, and then there is that lack of like whether having people that who might care for you around or not, and then many people not lucky enough to have people that who could look out for them. In Change Makers, we had to actually share the very limited resources that we had. We had nothing for asylum seekers, and I do share the point that Golriz made around the some other marginalized communities are really concerned about the very limited resources will end up being shared with this group of people that who are coming. We don't know who they are, and potentially making their lives difficult. So and then we come to the issue of detention, and it's obviously the asylum, the Amnesty International report has summarized, that said it all, and in many cases what happened was quite, in many levels, unacceptable. So that's, now I'm very glad that actually the minister looked into that, and the Victoria QC review was inquiry was launched, and the report came out, and we accepted the report in principle. So hopefully it's a matter of now implementing the findings and recommendations in the report. So to go back to your question, why the distinction, why this was the policy, the distinction, the difference between why quota refugees have it all. When I first came, I was picked up from the airport and then taken to Mangere, and then from Mangere picked up on the plane to the airport in Wellington, picked up from airport. When I came, my apartment was full of things, and the support to continue until I didn't need it. So, and then you got the other group of people, the so-called convention refugees, like got nothing. This was in principle, I should say, that the policy that was put by the National Party, the previous government in 2012, put in place. Why? I don't know. I can't figure out that at the time I remember it meant to be temporary. What they said was that they decided at the time, they decided to do the quota refugee first and then come back after an initial period and look into including the convention refugees into the process. It could have been easy to do it then, because it's actually, if you look into it, doing it at the time was easier than not doing it, because like if you look into the difficulties and the issue these people go through, it's actually costs more money. Because of what they go through, the severe mental health, and all the ups and downs, it's actually, it would have been easier to include them into the process and to get on with it. So now now that we are here, we are having this discussion, is we making progress, obviously. We must accept the basic principle of equality of treatment between these two groups if we want to make a progress. So now we in principle, we accepted the equality of the treatment. Now we just need to look into how do we implement it? How do we go, we do know it's wrong. It's unfair. And so we accepted in principle that these two groups must be treated equally. And now how do we get on with it? How can we implement it? That's the question. And it's not going to be hard. If there is a will, there is a way. So we're going to work through these things together.
Yeah, that's great. And I'd like to come to implementation in just a minute for you, Golriz. But actually, Solomon, I was just wondering if I could maybe just hear from you, because I mean, you've also had that experience as a convention refugee. I mean, And Ibrahim had sort of spoken about his experience and how that was possibly different from someone else's. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like for you once you were granted convention refugee status? What were some of the things that were different? What do you think are some of the main issues?
Yeah, it's definitely a turning point. It's a milestone. It's in my life. At least I realize I have a country to live forever. Yeah. But when I got the letter, it says you have been received, so you can apply for permanent residence. That was what it said. So there is no another thing. So I was applying only for permanent residence. But once I start applying for permanent residence, I find it's very complicated and very long. So I was lucky enough, I got a lawyer, but it took me like 20 months, the whole 20 months to finish. So that is the thing I can remember. Also, the time you spend, like all the time you spend, even for getting the permanent residence, it's not counted later for your residency, for your citizenship. Like, for example, in Australia, they try to make up that one. So for quota refugee and asylum seekers, they give them in 4 years. So only you have to live minimum 1 year with permanent residence. So that is one thing about permanent residence. Even though it's very long, it doesn't consider for your, it doesn't count. The second point was there is no clear information once you get permanent residence. You don't know what to do. There is no any organization that follows up to you. So you go by your own, as you have to navigate yourself and find. So it took me like 6 months to realize that I'm entitled for social housing. I didn't know because nobody told me actually. There is no also clear information. So I was lucky enough. I got one girl from Changemakers again. Her name was Batu, if I'm right. She was working there. I give credit to her. She told me you can apply for.
Her name is Batul.
Yeah, Batul. Thank you, Ibrahim. So she is like, just I came here. I met her in any like it was like casual in any. It was some kind of some event or something. So we were talking. Then I told her. So I was lucky enough. She saved me. Just I waited then 3-4 months. Then I got a house. Then it's the first time in my life. Then I feel maybe I can't say safe. When I got house, I just feel maybe the safe definition is a bit different for me or for an asylum seeker who's living in New Zealand. It's not only absence of risk. You know, it means to feel settled, to feel peace, to feel kind of freedom. You know, so. So there should be some organization responsible, or there should be some clear information has to be given for those convention refugee, so they know what to do. Also, I have another experience. I go for medical checkup to have a GP because I thought it's important to have a GP. I was waiting for asylum for the refugee status. Then I went there and she told me you are not eligible. You need to have a permanent residence. Then I said, okay, but I cannot ask anybody because there is no clear like white and black. I said, maybe I have to wait. I was lucky, I was not sick, so just I left it. I was waiting only for permanent residence. So you keep to wait for permanent residence only to ask your entitlements. So that is there is lack of information there. Of course, the third point is maybe we know it. Once you get permanent residence, it helps you for employment. So employment is there. We all know that finding employment is based on your merit and in your experience and so on and so on. But for asylum seeker, if I'm going to talk from my experience, because there is unfair start, I can dare to say that it's not safe start. So it takes time to recover. It can be months or it can be years. It depends on the people. But it took me a while to just recover. After you recover, also you need to be in the right mental set. That's also not easy to get the balance, because even if you get some interviews or some chances, you can't catch it. You are still, it's like any other in life.
So thanks, Solomon. You've really painted a picture around some of these significant differences. And Ibrahim spoke about how when he arrived, he was a permanent resident basically on arrival, and how you had all this uncertainty and didn't even know how to apply for, or what the process of applying for permanent residency and why permanent residency can matter. But it also seems that there's even just this thing around confusion across the sector and government, even around, because we have these different categories of people that creates different rights and entitlements, that it might even mean that people who actually have a right to a certain entitlement or form of support are missing out on it simply because our system is too confusing. And Ibrahim, you also spoke about how that these things actually in the long term probably cost us more money. So this doesn't only make sense from looking to support people and their well-being, but also from an economic standpoint, it also makes dollars and cents as well. Golriz, I'd kind of like to turn to you now, because we've just kind of discussed some of these disparities, and what might be some ways forward? What would you think would be some ways to try and address this?
I think the starting point is that the change is really long overdue, and we've had many different reports, many different sector-based experts and communities telling successive governments that we need to change the way we support asylum seekers and refugees, and the disparity needs to end. So I really appreciate Ibrahim saying that the government has accepted this, but actually that's not enough. This is a Labour majority government that have an expert refugee background person within their caucus. So, and I know Ibrahim is working towards this, but there needs to be movement at the front bench. So we actually need this funding to be signed off. We actually need the minister, and I'm so happy that we can work with a new fresh minister now, but it needs to be prioritized. It actually is time that we go, these changes are simple. We're already supporting one group in a very particular way with long-standing sector, community-based groups, supporting them in terms of integration, in terms of accessing their entitlements that Solomon has spoken about. It's not that hard to say we're going to resource you to support asylum seekers as well. And the way that we've all, I think, touched on that issue of there's a lack of information about how to access services, and that idea that there needs to be an information point, and that's exactly what quota refugees get through the resettlement program. So they do have a point of contact. To say that we're going to resource that for asylum seekers is the bare minimum that has to happen immediately. Then to say, okay, well, we're going to resource the actual service providers as well in a different way, and that we'll prioritize things like mental health, because this is a group that has particular mental health requirements, is that other thing where this is actually a question of resource. It's not a question of we don't know what people need. We know what people need. They're traumatized new arrivals who need a point of contact to access the existing services, and then they need mental health care, physical health care. So to be told that you're not a permanent resident and you can't access a GP is the quintessential thing that asylum seekers get told. So do refugees. And then we know actually that our welfare system needs to change for everyone. So we have the WEAG report. Where are those recommendations gone? Accepting reports is actually not enough, because there are marginalized communities waiting for that access that can't keep having reports done. And then I do think that we need to stop and kind of go, Arbitrary detention is unlawful. The report has found that we actually need law change to make that very clear. You can't actually detain asylum seekers for a lack of travel documents, for example. That's in the Refugee Convention. You can't just assume that they're a security risk based on things where there's no charge or trial. So that's unlawful. So that's a really easy law change. And then you look at what Solomon has talked about, which is actually a really, really serious issue. And I don't think it's good enough to say that there's confusion in government departments about different groups arriving. There's one act. The Immigration Minister and INZ have one act. It's the Immigration Act, so that we can expect them to know what's in there. Refugees are different than migrants in the sense that we have accepted that once you have the right to refugee protection, you then have a right to become a permanent resident. So for us to say once your case is processed that you then just go into the ordinary immigration pathway is actually wrong. That's a misunderstanding of the right to refugee protection. What we've signed on to with the Refugee Convention is the right to permanent residency. They shouldn't have to then, once they've proven a well-founded fear of persecution or war, then prove things like the fit standard of health that we impose on other migrants. And I have opinions on that too, but the fact that we're imposing that on refugees and then requiring them to get a police clearance from their state, from their nation of origin. You know, things like that are what Solomon is talking about in terms of the huge delay in refugees accessing their right to permanent residency. What it means is they can't access work in the same way, as he said, healthcare in the same way, they can't integrate in a safe way, and they can't do things like bring their immediate family members here. So we have families being separated.
So it really sounds like across a range of rights, the issues around the availability, the accessibility are things that we need to work on.
There's resource issues and then there's legal change issues. So, and they're both really clear. Like we've been hearing them for so long. This is the frustration in my voice.
So thank you, Golriz. I would have, I think we could easily go for another hour or certainly longer. So, but Ibrahim, is there anything that you would like to just, I'm aware that we're at time, but is there anything that you would like to say in relation to any of this? You're on mute again, Ibrahim.
I can't get used to this. Look, what I would say is this is the issue that's been really overlooked for many years, and like I said before, I still can't figure out why in 2012 the previous government has parked this group of people, and they said that they're probably gonna go back to it, but they didn't, and to me, morally it's wrong to exclude group of people from basic rights of you know, like basically helping them to have a safe start in life. It's you know, it's simple as that. There is this issue of could probably gonna encourage many more asylum seekers to turn up on our shores. I think the evidence all shows that we have, as an example, we have Tampa refugees that didn't encourage other people to come. And there is no evidence to suggest that the asylum seekers number have been increasing. I think the 500 number that we have, it's been consistent throughout many years. So, and in regard to the detention issue, I know that people have been detained because of due to where they come from. You know, if you are male, single male coming from Middle East or Africa, straight away detention. So this is all now has been identified in the report, and hopefully, unless there is a clear evidence of like a security risk, we're not going to detain people. And in regard to the where from here, I think that's the elephant in the room. I think this is just things that could be done through some policy changes. I know there are a lot of cracks around basic information, around the delay in people, once they are recognized as a refugee, and then there is a delay to get their PR, and all these things can be done through some policy changes. And the fact that we have been together, working together in the last few, many of us, we've been speaking on these issues for many years, and now from my position in a caucus, and I'm not the only person in our caucus who actually cares about this. A lot of people do, but I closely work with Minister Twyford and Vanushi Walters, and myself have been taking a lead on this. And I'm pretty sure, hopefully, in the next few months, maybe let's just hope that 12 months or next year, this time we could look back and say, boy, we have come a long way. We made it happen. So to me, through the policy changes, hopefully we're going to achieve many of this.
So thanks, Ibrahim. And I think, you both have really highlighted the importance of thinking about resourcing policy and legal changes that can be made in this space.
If I may, Jay, just to add a couple of points that look, the current government's commitment to refugee issues is not it's quite clear. The fact that now for many years we have been begging Australian government to bring those who have been detained in Manus Island, and now we accepted 150 of those people will be coming, and we did have the previous government left a discriminatory policy against Middle East and African men. This is in quota, and we got rid of that. I know that Golriz is one of the people who advocate for that as well. Look, the list goes on, and the commitment is there, and that we just need to get on with things.
So I'm just aware that we need to sign off here, and thanks, Ibrahim. And yes, I agree. I think that there's some good momentum, and let's certainly try to continue that. Solomon, is there anything just very quickly that you'd like to say before I close off with the karakia?
It's all said. So let's keep the momentum going, and we are also lucky. We have Ibrahim Omer. He was also asylum seeker, conventional refugee, and quota refugee. So it's a huge advantage for us because he knows it well. And let's do it. Yeah, I will reach there. Hopefully, I am sure we'll reach there soon. Thank you.
So thank you, Solomon. And again, also, Ibrahim, thank you. You have been a tremendous support, even as we are constructing the Safe Start Fair Future document, and really looking forward to working with you as we continue that important mahi. So if I can just close now with a karakia. Unahia, 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 ki te uru tapu nui, kia watia, kia mama, te nako, te tinana, te wairua I te ara takata, koia ra I rongo, whakaaria ake ki runga, kia tina, huie, tai kie. Thank you everyone for attending the Safe Start Fair Future webinar. As we said, let's continue the momentum. There's an opportunity to sign the document that we've shared in the chat around getting behind the recommendations of the Safe Start Fair Future report. And again, I'd like to thank the panelists who spoke with us today, and also to the audience who stayed, and for your forbearance as we work through the technical issues. Kia ora, good afternoon, and look forward to continuing the conversation.